Well, good afternoon. I would like to welcome all of you to the Stockbridge Library, Museum, and Archives online poetry series. We are in season 2 of the series, and the theme for this year is the refuge of witnessing. I would like to welcome John Gillespie, who is a former board president of the trustees of the Stockbridge Library, Museum, and Archives. And John has been instrumental in the seed for the idea and for orchestrating and leading our sessions. So John, thank you very much. We have had a wonderful array of poets from around the country and around the world. And I'm delighted to welcome poet Jane Clarke today, who is joining us from Ireland on this, what in the Berkshires is a misty St. Patrick's Day afternoon. A few words about Jane. She is the author of 2 poetry collections, The River and When the Tree Falls, and also an illustrated chapbook entitled All the Way Home. And she has a 3rd collection on the way, which will come out in June of 2023. Jane's awards include the 2016 Hennessy Literary Award for Poetry and the 2016 Listowel Writers Week Poem of the Year. The River was the first poetry collection ever shortlisted for the Royal Society of Literature Award, and that's given for a distinguished work of fiction or nonfiction. And Jane's work will feature in Wake Forest Irish Poetry Series and 100 Queer Poems. And just a little bit about Jane's background. She grew up on a farm in County Roscommon. She holds an honors degree in English and philosophy from Trinity College, Dublin, and a master's in philosophy in writing from the University of South Wales. And Jane lives with her wife in County Wicklow, where she is joining us from today. So thank you, Jane. Thank you, John. I will turn the program over to the 2 of you.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. Yeah, it's great to have an Irish poet on St. Patrick's Day. Wendy, I think we're getting too sophisticated here. We're doing too many, things to, no, all good stuff. No, we're very happy to have Jane speak to us from Ireland today. I guess it's around 4 o'clock. So a beautiful day in Ireland for St. Patty's Day. So that's nice. So Jane, we start off, we want to know what does refuge mean for you, or where do you find refuge?
Well, I've been thinking about that question. I think it's such a good question. And, the first thing that comes to mind is home. And, that's home here in Wicklow with my partner. But it's also home in the sense of having been part of a community. And it's also home, it's the garden, it's the walks around here, it's the hills, it's the mountains, it's place. Place is really important to me. And that sense of belonging in a place, and so that's definitely it. I mean, the other thing I was thinking about is friendship. That's also refuge for me, really, good, close friends, and good conversation. I find a place of refuge, intimate conversation, honest conversation. That I know that all through my life, that's been a place of refuge. And then I was also thinking, of course, reading and writing. And from when I was a child, I grew up on a farm in County Roscommon, and that's in the west of Ireland. And I was the only girl. I had 4 brothers. So I did escape some of the farm work, and I spent a lot of time reading. And I do think that stimulated my imaginative world, but also that it was a place of refuge and a place of, it's a kind of a private place, a place of your own, you and your book. My mother tells the story that there was a flood, a flash flood coming through the kitchen in the house. And I was sitting there on a chair with my legs up reading while they were all sweeping the water out of the tile in the kitchen. And she loves telling that story. But I suppose that, that just says how absorbed I was. And then, writing I came to much later in life. It's only in my early 40s I started to write. But I definitely would say that writing is a place of refuge for me. And, maybe I'll talk more about that when I read some poems. But, at various times since I started to write, say when my father died or when my very close friend died, I really found that the being able to write a poem in response was refuge. And maybe just the last thing I'd say is I'm very aware, of, what's happening in the Ukraine and what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Afghanistan, and the number of people around the world who are looking for refuge just as we speak. And so I suppose I just wanted to acknowledge that, and that, I think they're very much in our minds at the moment. When you say that, when you ask the question about refuge, you can't really answer it without thinking about the number of people at the moment looking for refuge,
So Jane, I'm going to give you one of our awards for most places of refuge. Wendy, make a note. Next time we're going to ask people where they don't find refuge. Please just tell us. Refuge is everywhere. It's like air. It's like water. It's everywhere. You can't avoid it. Where don't you find it? Probably like when you're throwing stuff out in the garbage pail. I don't know. No, I'm joking. A little joke. No, it's great. I think that let me ask you this. So, so many things: place, good friends, conversations, writing. So let's say place or people. Which one of those shows up more in your writing? Is it from place or is it from people?
I think it's probably both. Somebody who was reading my work lately said he was really struck by how I people the landscape. So I think it's, I'm very much a poet of landscape, of place, but there are people in those places usually. So I actually couldn't choose one or the other. I think we're very shaped by our places and we shape our places. So I feel a real interdependence there.
Okay. Okay. So are there a couple of poems you'd like to read that?
Yes. Yeah. I wondered actually, would I start with a poem by a Ukrainian poet, Shevchenko, just because of our times.
Yeah.
And he was, he's that 19th century Ukrainian poet who is so loved in the Ukraine, even to this day. I think he's the equivalent of Yeats for us in Ireland. Yeah. So anyway, I just thought I'd start with that. This poem was translated by Alexander Moykel, and it was written in 1847, which is, it actually sounds very modern, but anyway, it was written in 1847. As the sun sets and hills grow dark, as the bird song ends and fields fall silent, as the people laugh and take their rest, I watch. My heart hurries to the twilit gardens of Ukraine, and I hurry. Oh, how I hurry with my thoughts as my heart yearns for rest. As the fields grow dark, as the groves grow dark, as the hills grow dark, I see a star and I weep. Hey, you star, have you reached Ukraine? Do dark eyes scour the blue sky for you? Or don't they care? May they sleep if they don't. May they know nothing of my fate.
Wow.
So.
Very nice.
Yeah, and he was exiled for about 10 years because of his writing. They banned him And he kept on writing, you know, wonderful poet. But so, and then if I could read, you know, some other poems in the, you know, to the theme of refuge. One is from my first collection, which is called The River. And I was thinking that often, in my experience, I suppose, especially because of always living in the country, mostly, I lived in Dublin for about 15 years, but apart from that, I've mostly lived in rural Ireland. I think people find refuge with animals. And so this one it's about my grandmother, whose mother died when she was only about 8. She lived in a little farm up on the north coast of Ireland in Donegal. So her mother died that young. Her mother died in childbirth, actually. So this is me imagining my grandmother, her response. Among the cows. Her father knew her to find her. She liked to stand among the cows. They smelled of winter and the dark. They let her lean into their warm bellies. She watched them in the fields as they moved solid and slow, wrapped their tongues around sweet grass. She found her own tune in their lowing, learned to milk as soon as her hands were strong enough to squeeze. When her mother died, her father wore his grief the way he wore his Sunday suit, as if it belonged to someone else. She would listen to the calves calling for days when weaned, until their voices, exhausted, faded like mist from the fields. So
nice,
I'll read
nice.
another poem of refuge. Is this is a poem that'll be in my next collection, and it's again the link between human beings and animals. And this is a little sequence I've written about mining in County Wicklow. There was a lot of mining in County Wicklow for about 300 years. And I spoke to one of the miners when I was writing this sequence. I spoke to a few miners, but I spoke to one of them who subsequently died. And he told me that he'd worked with the ponies, in the pit ponies. And you could see his eyes became alight. And he said he was so wonderful to get out of the tunnel and come up and work with the pit ponies. And so that started a poem for me. And again, for me, it's kind of the refuge of the trust in the animals. Pit ponies of Glendassan.
Well, just tell us first, what is a pit pony?
Oh, well, they're the ponies that pull
the stuff out of the mine?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So they were a particular size. They were usually a small, sturdy pony.
Okay.
Yeah. And Glendassan is the valley where the mining happened, which is, you know, only about 15 minutes from where we live. Pit ponies of Glendassan, hitched to an 8-hour shift in Britchen's hames and traces, they follow the miners' carbide lights, halt under hoppers, turn on a threepence and lean into their collars to pull the 5-wagon train. Low-set cobs from the Curragh, a piebald and 2 greys. Their hooves fall heavy as hammers on granite. They haul lengths of larch for pit props, pneumatic drills, boxes of gelignite, and from time to time deliver injured men back to daylight. The miners pat their necks in passing and feed them windfall apples, comrades in toil, and first to stall, legs locked at a sudden rumbling, a change in the air, or the rush of running water. And I'll just read 2 poems from this Wendy mentioned in the introduction, the illustrated pamphlet. So these are all poems in response to a family archive held in a library in London. And they invited me to read the archive. It's a lot of letters from a soldier in the First World War back to his sister. And that led to this group of 21 poems with photographs from the archive as well. But one of the themes that I came across when doing the research about World War I was the number of refugees. And there were a number of refugees in Europe. And of course, as you know, now today with the Ukraine, people are saying it's the biggest number since the Second World War and the First World War. So this one is about a refugee who actually managed to bring a piano with her. So I've put it in the voice of the people that she comes among when she gets refuge. And again, what I was thinking about is how much refugees bring to the countries they go to. You know, sometimes the narrative is that we're giving to them, but so often refugees bring so much. So that was in my mind writing this. Refugee. No one knew how she smuggled a piano wrapped in a blanket all the way from the city. We didn't want trouble. Neighbors said we should burn it. But if you saw how she touched it, you'd know why we found a hiding place in a distant shed. Like everyone else, she spent long days in the fields. But come the night, she'd be gone for hours at a time. We didn't ask, didn't want to know. Only sometimes we heard notes carried as if from the heavens by hard frost or on the wind. Maybe
Very
one
nice.
last
Yeah.
poem for Refuge, maybe?
Yeah, sure. Listen, yep, absolutely. Nope, all good. I like that.
So this one is also from this same pamphlet. And you see, I was reading the letters between the brother and sister, and I was the brother died about a month on the front, about a month before the end of the war. He went in September 1918, and he died just before the end of the war. And I was thinking, what must it have been like for his sister? And I know that she was very moved, obviously, because she did a kind of a pilgrimage back to where he was buried every year. She'd go back with some friends. She herself was a pianist, in fact. But so this is imagining, this is in her voice, the sister's voice, after her brother has died. Snow began to fall before dawn, blown horizontal in easterly winds from across the hill. By evening, it lies deep in banks and drifts. Hedges become whitewashed walls. Barrels turn into haystacks. The woodpile disappears. I could almost believe that we haven't received your mud-caked kit. Breeches ripped from ankle to hip, bloodied tunic, your helmet slightly dinged, and the watch you won at school. I could almost believe you'll be with us for dinner, having walked in your trench boots all the way home through the snow.
Wow. Very nice. I mean, how long did that project last in terms of?
Well, I suppose I was working on it for about a year, I think. Yeah. I was probably doing other work at the same time, but I was you know, the library sent me all the, you know, copies of the letters, and I was able to look at other artifacts online. And then I did go and read in London, and his grandniece, their grandniece, was at that reading. And
Nice.
it meant a lot to her that their family was being remembered.
Nice. really nice.
Yeah.
Hey, I always like to have a little time for audience Q&A before the clock runs out. So if anyone has a question for Jane, we'll also have a little Q&A session a little later on. But if you had a question, and you could, let's see, there's something in the chat here. Well, Kathy said one of your prior poems is beautiful. So no, I'm not hearing any questions. So we'll just keep moving ahead.
That's fine. Yeah.
So let's talk about witnessing.
Yes.
How does that, obviously I should say, tell me the things you don't witness, because I know once you start, Wendy, the Jane Clarke list is long and deep. So we have to get off this show by midnight. So we only have a little time. No, I'm kidding. No, just tell us
Yeah, I
what
probably
witnessing
haven't.
means for you. Yeah.
I've probably got a shorter answer for this, but yeah, I mean, I suppose witness. One thing that comes to mind is when I was starting to write, I read a lot of Mary Oliver, who I still really admire. I love her work. And one of the things that she talks about, both in her poetry and in her any of her talk about writing, she talked about paying attention. And I think that's a big part of being a witness, is that paying attention. And it's a paying attention, how I see it, is to the external and the internal. So that you're paying attention to what you see, to what you hear, to what's around you. I mean, I remember, I don't know if it was Mary Oliver who said, but that every time you go on a walk, just notice three things, even if you notice three things with intensity. And because I write a lot of poems of nature and of landscape, and that's really important to me. I mean, I think, you probably know Mary Oliver had her pencil in a tree, so that she'd never be without a pencil when she was walking.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
And she always brought paper in her pocket, just in case she saw something or it was, So I love that sense of being so open to what's around you. And so that's one thing that's very important to me. I suppose the other thing about witness is, because I trained as a psychotherapist and worked as a psychotherapist, and then worked in community development and adult education, I suppose I've always been interested in other people, and I've always been interested in other people's lives. And I think I was an observer from very young. I think that was a stance I often took, watching dynamics around me. I've always been interested in human dynamics. So I think that's part of the witnessing. I think that goes into my poems a lot. I write a lot of poems of stories. I'm often inspired by things people say to me, by a story maybe that somebody would tell. So that's a kind of witnessing. And maybe the other witnessing is it comes out of my politics, out of how I see the world in terms of power differentials, in terms of, what's happening to our environment, those kind of issues. That's another kind of a witnessing, a kind of a political, like what Carolyn Forshey has done so brilliantly, all her work on poetry of witness, which is so wonderful, So there you are, a good few examples again, John.
There you go. Yeah, that's all right. You're very, very, very expressive. So, so Donna put something in the chat. She wanted to know what brought you to poetry, because your thoughts are so warm and loving.
Well, I think I always wanted to write. I had that dream. And when I was young, I tried to write and it just didn't work out for me. And I think I trained as a psychotherapist in my 30s, and I found that experience very, it just turned me upside down and inside out. That training in psychotherapy was psychoanalytic. So it was very long, a 7-year training, and very intense. And during that time, I was doing a lot of grieving, which I think is a necessary part of psychotherapy. And I remember turning to poetry then, turning to, people like Elizabeth Bishop, but also, of course, Seamus Heaney, Patrick Kavanagh, with so many poets. And to me, it seems like it was that psychotherapy that opened up something in me, opened up my creativity. And then that I moved. And so it was after that I started to write in my early 40s. So to my mind, they're very connected.
And then when did you stop? Because you must have stopped, or you're still doing kind of psychotherapy work?
I stopped that probably in my mid 40s. I mean, I've been working with groups right up until recently, but it wasn't so intensely about being a psychotherapist. I was facilitating. I did a lot of facilitating conflict and planning and evaluations, and teamwork, that kind of work. That's what I have been doing, but I'm now a full-time writer, which is actually wonderful. But I was doing that up until October, 12 months, And really it was lockdown that changed things, because when I was asked to go back after lockdown, I realized I wanted to concentrate on my writing from now on, Yeah.
Nice. Very good. Very good. So maybe there are a few poems that have that, paying attention, witnessing, that you can share with us.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm going to read another. This is a poem that'll be in my next collection, but I thought to read it because I said about sometimes I meet someone and it gets a poem going. So I was doing a writing residency on Achill Island, which is on the west coast of Ireland, and we were on a walk one day, and I met this fisherman who had worked in a fishery where they killed basking sharks back in, the 40s, 50s. Yeah. And he talked about it, and it led to this poem. So I see this as a poem of witness, because it's about environmental destruction and it's about hope for change. At Percheen Harbour, basking sharks, docile as seal pups, harpooned and netted from currachs, were towed one by one to the fishery at the slipway. Fathers and sons sliced off dorsal fins and hacked through blubber to reach oil-filled livers. Sweating in burnhouse heat, they shoveled bleeding flesh into the rendering machine. They couldn't wash the smell from their skin, not if they swam to Inishgalvan at the end of every shift. Year by year, the catch diminished, then disappeared. But late last April, old men cheered from the headland and said it was as if they had been forgiven. A school of 12 cruised into Keem Bay, moontail swishing, fins proud as yawl sails above the waves. And just to say, basking sharks have only just been given protected status in the waters around Ireland. It's a wonderful thing, and people have campaigned for years. And in a way, again, isn't there something so fitting, because we fished them out of existence. They didn't come back for many years. Now they've come back, and now they have protected status. So there's something very hopeful in that, I think.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot of that in Maine, protected status. Between lobsters, the scallop season ended early. It's every week in the paper there's some fishing story, fishing limitations, fishing permits.
Yeah. So I thought another poem of witness. This is from lockdown, from early on, the first April of lockdown. as you know, in Ireland, as you probably know, in Ireland, the rites around a funeral, the rituals around funeral, are a very important part of the culture. And so, of course, in lockdown, we weren't able to have funerals in the way we would have had, and neighbours weren't able to go and pay their respects in the way that's so important to us. So what we did here, and I mean, I can see where we were standing as I speak, we stood along the road when a woman who had grown up in a cottage just across the road from us, when she died, the hearse drove down the road and all the neighbours stood on either side of the little by road to pay their respects. So this is a poem of witness from that day. So just to say, first earlies, I don't know if people know, that's the earliest potatoes. They're called first earlies, the earliest potatoes that are harvested. I think everything else is understandable. First earlies. By rights, we'd be standing side by side, making idle conversation as we wait to shake hands with our grieving neighbours after Requiem Mass in Green Anne. But we keep the byroad between us today. The virus lingers, a low-lying cloud, until someone asks about planting first earlies. Advice flies from gateway to gateway. You can split seed potatoes as long as each half has a chit. Dig plenty of manure into the drill. Place them a foot apart, a fist deep. Don't forget to earth up the shoots. They'll be ready for lifting mid-June. Sharps Express, Satanta, Orla, Slaney, Red Cara, Accord. Our litanies only hushed by the hearse coming down the road.
Very powerful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe I'll bring, you see, I'll read one from my parents, because they were, my mother is still alive. My father died 5 years ago. They're both muses for my work, definitely.
Yeah.
And Daddy told, my mother still tells a lot of stories, and they definitely inspire a lot of poems for me. So I'll just give one, this is one of them, and this is in my second collection, When the Tree Falls, which is primarily an elegiac collection for my father. The Yellow Jumper. They weren't married long when she saw it. A turtleneck jumper in Murray's window, yellow as happiness, as the flash on a goldfinch's wings. She imagined him wearing it at the fairs, standing out from all the rest in their greens and greys. 18 shillings and sixpence she paid for it on tick, threepence a week. For all that he smiled on his birthday, it remained on the back of the bedroom chair. One day she folded and packed it in the chest with the spare candles, letters, photographs, and the other questions she didn't ask. She likes to think of him there, among pens of breeding heifers, weanlings and hoggets, splendid in yellow.
Wow. Very descriptive. Yeah, I always think with storytelling, there needs to be, family fact checking. Yeah, Misha's on the call. Misha was our former neighbor. Misha probably, sometimes I tend to, I make my childhood stories a lot more memorable, or even neighborhood stories. And part of it is there's always this fact checking about, I don't know, did that really happen that way?
I
Very
know,
nice.
isn't it funny? Don't you have to kind of free yourself though as a poet? You have to let the poem take life of its own in a way. I think if I was too held by, well, and the other thing, of course, is that everybody remembers things differently. So that's very freeing in a way.
Yeah. I'll just share one thing. So this meditation I did today with 10% Happier was talking about, a childhood memory and how that built into where you are today. So what popped into mind, hasn't for a while. I used to ride the MTA, the trolley from Chestnut Hill in Newton, where I lived, for 10 cents to Riverside and get a free ride back. Now, you told anybody that you'd let a 10-year-old do that now, you'd be,
Yeah.
family services would be called. But that used to be the biggest thrill, that I would just get on, and there weren't anybody really on at midday, and I just got to ride on this little,
Yes.
MBTA trolley.
Yeah.
And, sometimes I do it 2 or 3 times in a row, spend 30 cents or try to get another free ticket. So yeah,
That's
all the good
lovely
stuff.
memory. Yes. Yeah.
So it'd be great to hear some more out of that, The Tree Falls, if you feel like it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I'll read one from quite early on in that collection. And this is before my father died, when in his last few years he became ill quite often. And this is one of those times. And I guess there's a witnessing here as well. He stood at the top of the stairs, insisting he could go down himself. But like a frightened bullock refusing the crush, his body wouldn't move from the spot where I used to sit in the dark, listening to rows in the kitchen when my mother showed him the bill from the shop. He stood at the top of the stairs in a fever that came on him as fast as nightfall in winter. Steep, narrow steps between him and the ambulance ticking outside the back door. He stood there in checked pajamas and thick Wellington socks in the house where he was born and swore he would never leave. I held him from behind, my brother in front, coaxing with the tenderness I'd never seen between them. Come on, Dad, just one step, one step.
Oh, great. Wow. Woo.
And then there's kind of a companion poem to it, if I could read it as well. This was, again, in this time, these years before my father died, when this time he was quite ill in hospital, and I was in Spain at the time and couldn't be there. I was actually doing a writing workshop in Spain. And it was something about the distance that gave it, again, another intensity. So this poem, that I could take away from him these long days in the hospital, the digging for a vein in his arm, the drip that stops him sleeping, the pain that makes him whisper, Jesus Christ, oh Jesus Christ, that I could take him back to his cobblestones and barn, his rooks in the birch trees, his nettles and ditches, limestone and bog, that I could find the words to tell him what he will always be, horse chestnut petals falling pink in the yard, the well hidden in a blackthorn thicket, a summer evening's hush, cattle standing orange in the shallows.
So is the book all about your
It's
your dad?
mostly about my father, but in just a few months before my father died, my very close friend died, and she had been ill for about 4 years with cancer. And I had been, very much a part of her care. So both Shirley and my father in here, but probably more poems about my father. But I think the fact that I had two very significant bereavements in such a short time, like within months of each other, I know that propelled me to do this kind of work. So even though, most of the poems are about Dad, I feel that Shirley's spirit is in there, and she was also a poet.
Yeah, nice.
Her spirit is in there too, very much,
So Kathy Haley has a question in the chat. When you're writing poems based on family stories, what kind of questions do you ask yourself that help you get to a powerful ending as your poems have illustrated?
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I mean, I suppose working on the ending it's really important. And, sometimes it just comes, the ending comes very easily, but sometimes it's, sometimes I have an ending and I just cut it off, and then you're left with more bareness. I mean, I do sort of, it's sometimes there's a tendency to want to tie a red bow on the ending and make everything all right. And I think there's something about being able to bear, to feel pain and to feel deeply, that allows you to go deep for the ending, if that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I think that's all that I can say, but I know that I do work hard on those final lines, and often I'm not happy with the ending. I go back until I can get it.
Yeah, do you think poets obsess about the endings?
Yeah, well, isn't it? I mean, look, the beginning and the ending, that first line is really important.
Yeah,
too.
Mary Oliver's The Journey. I read the first line and I want to jump out of my chair and run down the street.
Absolutely.
I can't. You finally knew what you had to do.
Yes, I know. And if, I agree, all you need is just that kind of a line. It's fantastic. There is a poem in The River, which is absolutely inspired by The Journey, by Mary Oliver's poem,
Yeah.
The Journey. So could I
Oh, absolutely. Listen, there's no script. Do what you want.
I'm delighted that, first of all, it's great you mentioned that poem. And secondly, it's nice to get to read this today, because this is going, the Everyman Library of Poetry. I mean, it's just so wonderful, all these lovely, beautiful little poetry books. There's, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of them. But this year they're bringing out one of river poems. It's specifically river poems. And they've asked to include this poem in it, which, of course, I'm absolutely honored about. But anyway, it was originally inspired by Mary Oliver, and it's also, the theme is about the salmon going up the river again to spawn. Against the flow. One day you knew you must turn, begin to swim against the current, leave the estuary waters, brackish with sediment, head upstream through riffles and deeps, mill races that churn in spate, over sheets of granite, across weirs, into rapids that thunder pound, squeeze between boulders to the upper reaches of the river. Those waters of blanket bog brown, where you'd find a place in gravel and silt to hollow a dip, to spawn a life of your own.
Very nice. Yeah, it's 1:45. I want to make sure if anyone else has a question or a comment. I know we're reading them out of the chat, but you could unmute yourself and jump in. You don't have to, but I always say, don't let the poet off easy. Now give her some questions. No, I think Jane, you've been good. So you haven't, you've been quite open. So I don't think we've let you off easy. You've been sharing quite a bit. So.
And just to say, I really appreciate the audience. It's really nice to see you there, and because I know there's a lot of other things to be doing on a day like today. Yeah.
So if you put the two together, you know, the sometimes we do this, sometimes we don't. The refuge of witnessing. And the question I ask people, you know, we've been experiencing, I guess, kind of witnessing overload to maybe where witnessing isn't a refuge anymore. It's something we might want to turn away from. I don't know. I just feel like all the things you mentioned, the Afghanistan, Ukraine, you know, everything. You could make a list of all the things that are challenging in the world. I'm just wondering, are we experiencing witnessing overload? Is it really a refuge anymore, or should we be running away?
Well, I mean, I know what you mean, that sometimes, you know, all that is happening in the wider world, and I think particularly around climate change, you know, that ultimate threat to our very existence. And just I mean, sometimes I'm overwhelmed with sadness, you know, about what's happening in our very fragile world. So I do think but I think it seems to me that poetry supports us with that, because there's something about, in a way, because poetry is small and intense and concise. I think that is the refuge of witnessing, that we do need refuge in that way. And I suppose just I do want to say that, you know, that when I was grieving my father and my friend, it was a refuge to be able to write. And all the times when the world seems so mad or so hopeless, I feel like the writing, any creativity is the opposite of hopelessness, I think. Because just in the making, there's something hopeful, whatever you make.
Yeah.
It's, you know, so, but I mean, I don't want to deny, you know, feelings of being overwhelmed. I think that is part of our human experience, and maybe we would be wooden if we didn't feel that as humans. I think maybe we have to feel these things, you know, and then find ways of helping ourselves, helping each other with that. You know?
Nice. Yeah, very good description.
Mm.
So there are a few more poems you'd like to read?
Okay, yes, please. Because I mentioned my lovely friend Shirley, I'd like to read a poem that I wrote for her. And I suppose one of the things about I think it's a real honor, pleasure, treasure in life to have a friend over many, many, many years. And we were friends. We met in Trinity studying English, and you know, and then we both went to work in community development. We traveled in South America together when we were in our 20s, and then we both began to write poetry. Shirley first, and then afterwards I began to write poetry. So we were in a poetry group together. We were in a poetry reading group together. We gave readings together. So this poem is for Shirley McClure. Swim. In the early days of our friendship, we'd sit in the sun at Lacan Weir, teasing out thoughts and feelings like wool we'd washed in the Nore. We picked the fleece apart, loosening briars and dander, fluffing the locks till the fibres unmatted were ready to rove. We swam in the river stretching before us from Devil's Bit Mountain to the Barrow Bridge, until illness seeped in stealthy as groundwater after a storm. tonight in St. Vincent's, your sister and I sit by your bed in low light from above your pillowed head. Your body quivers with every breath. Do you know we're beside you? Can you hear us speak of you, sleek as an otter slipping into the river? The blinds are up and the city's twinkling from here to Capure, where the Liffey rises to the Wimbrel's call, then winds its way through darkness into the shallows of Dublin Bay.
Very nice, very powerful.
Thank you. I'll read another another poem for March. But maybe just before I read it, I do want to say that my publisher for my first and second collections and my upcoming collection is Blood Axe Books. I don't know if people know Blood Axe Books.
I don't know that.
Yeah,
I think it's in the bio, but I heard, I don't know all the publishers.
Yeah, the publisher, they're based in Northern England, and but they actually publish quite a few US poets, including Jane Hirschfield. But anyway, I suppose I just want to acknowledge I have a really good publisher, and I get great support from my publisher, and I just want it just makes a difference. Because, you know, as a writer, to take your place in the world, to feel confident about your work, it's really important to, and things like this reading, these kind of events help us keep writing. I think the generosity of all the people who invite us to do readings and also our publishers make a difference. I just wanted to say that. But here's a poem for this time of year. It's from the second collection, and it mentions March. But also, I suppose St. Patrick's Day is often about in Ireland, I often associated with birth of calves, birth of lambs. It was the time when you started to plant potatoes. You know, it's a time of new life. So I thought I'd, read this poem about new life. And it was inspired by my nephew, who's the farmer at home on the farm I grew up on. And he gave me the last line of the poem when he was only 10, and he was talking about having helped a ewe give birth, birthing the lamb. Almost dawn, a March wind whistles bitter through the shed, where the boy kneels to a ewe panting in the corner. Water's broken, eyes closed, lip curled. She strains with every contraction. His arm is far inside her, but his fingers can't find a hoof, not even the tip of a nose to guide him. Chest thumping, staccato breath, he tries to remember what his father said. Take it slow, good lad. Push back her head. Slip in your hand. Reach for a leg. That's it. Cup the hoof. Now ease it forward. Don't pull or jerk. Just a steady pressure. Streaked yellow and red, the lamb slithers out, gives a cough, a splutter, shakes its head. Taking her time, the ewe licks off the mucus and nuzzles her newborn to its feet. The boy sits back in the straw on his heels. For a moment, he forgets and turns to tell his father it was the best feeling.
Wow. Woo. Oh, this has been an amazing hour, really. Very, very, powerful. Your poems are very descriptive. I feel like I'm watching little movies in my head. So I think that's what poetry does.
Yes.
No, great. So we have time for one more poem, and then we have to, they call it exit stage left.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much, John, for your questions and for the way you framed the reading. I really like that.
Well, great.
And thanks to everybody who came along. I'm going to read a love poem to finish. And as you know, it's only in the last few years that lesbians and gays in Ireland can get married. So we had our civil partnership and subsequently our wedding after we were already together 19 years. So that's kind of different to having a wedding when you're maybe 2 or 3 years together or 4 years. So you have a lot more, maybe you don't have some of the illusions of young love. So, vows. I can't promise it's chiseled from gold in spirals that speak of forever. I can't tell you it's wise as a mountain with pines that reach for heaven. I can't promise it's flawless as honey gathered by bees in bell heather. I can't say it's simple as silk spun from cocoon into treasure, but I promise it's rooted as rowan with berries that sing to September. I promise its to and its fro will surprise like Glenmalure weather, a seasoned rowboat, moored or unmoored at your pleasure.
Well, there you did get it to the end. I can't do this, I can't do that. Rather than going through the whole. No, you're kidding. I'm joking. No, Jane. Thank you very much. This is my hour, as I call it, to recharge myself into the poetry wall. So this has been just a beautiful, beautiful hour, and thank you very much.
Thank
It's
you.
really been a pleasure for you to share your brilliance with us. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you,
Yes,
everybody.
and I second that. Jane, thank you. That was just very powerful and moving. We really appreciate you joining us.
Lovely. Thank you. My pleasure.
And we'll